I'll start off with a question from a lady called Kayla Ent, who asks, what about the national security threat of sharing our nuclear intelligence by developing Hinkley C with China? The higher our debt to China, the greater our vulnerability. Is this an issue? So would any of our panelists like to address that? Go on, Andy.
I could have a quick go. Yes, in the case of Hinkley, it's money really. It's financing was what was under discussion. In Bradwell, then there's more involvement, and then a possible onward plan from that with the Chinese designed reactors. And yeah, I mean, it's an issue. It's a really a sign of how pressurized the international nuclear industry is. And when I say nuclear industry, I mean the military and civil industry, because they are basically much more one thing than we realize. And you can't really explain the way things play out around the world without seeing them as one thing and seeing it as an industry trying to survive globally when both its power options and its weapons options are increasingly seen as obsolete. We can talk about that more. And the paradox that you see one nuclear weapon state relying on another nuclear weapon state to keep its nuclear infrastructure viable is a sign of what's really going on, that it's not about country versus country, it's about a massive global industry against often its home governments and its home citizens to keep itself going. That's the only way you can explain this kind of dependency between supposedly quite adversarial states like UK and China.
Fantastic. Okay. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to add to that question? Okie dokie, we'll move on. Here's another good one. It says, I'm not sure of the person's name, but they ask, or they say, it appears that much of the DARPA and similar funding for mini nukes and microgrids is aimed at providing power for next generation beam weapons and related terrestrial and space force requirements, and justification for a new round of enriched plutonium-238, etc., for space nuclear batteries and propulsion expansion. How might microgrids be disentangled from nuke policy and the next generation technology be effectively countered before they further hijack the sustainability agenda? Who would like to take that question? Anybody?
I don't want to be Mr. Big Mouth. Phil, do you want to pick up or?
You go first and I'll...
Yeah, okay. It's a great question. And sorry, I didn't catch the name of the person.
No, they just say DD on the...
All right, okay, well, thanks, VD. I think you're really on an emerging issue. At the moment, for reasons Phil especially outlined, it's really clear that the real big driver of the pressure to keep civil nuclear power is from submarine, and in the US and France, broader naval propulsion. They have aircraft carriers and other ships propelled by nuclear reactors as well in those countries. So it's naval propulsion is driving it now. But on the horizon, coming along very quick, as you said in your question, are directed energy weapons, basically lasers and other high energy weapons for anti-aircraft and other use from space and from the ground. So the vision of the military is to put battlefield nuclear reactors in position so they can power these new generation weapons. That's the vision that the US Army in particular is quite open about. So it's not a major factor now, I think, but I think it's coming along and the military is aware of it. And it's another reason why the British government and others are becoming so entrenched in nuclear, because they tie them together, but they won't talk about it. And how to get rid of it, I think we basically just need to recognize, smell the coffee, that both nuclear power on the civil side and on the military side are obsolete. And things go obsolete routinely. It's just up to culture in general to recognize when they've gone obsolete. And we just have to somehow convey that message in effective ways to the system. And they'll go the way other military obsolete technologies have gone in the past.
Yeah, I just add a kind of broad point about just really the role of the military in, and it's quite a sad fact, in sort of different waves of innovation, and particularly with nuclear. And of course, the nuclear thing started as a wave coming out of the Second World War. And it seems with these new weapons systems and so on, with regards to advanced nuclear, the next horizon of military conflict, space is the next frontier, literally, with regards to military tactics and warfare and these weapons and so on. And again, it looks like this new wave of means of waging violence could again be part of what propels nuclear. And so I think a broader point is really to, it's important to see just how connected so-called civil systems are with military, and make that transparent and challenge that. Yeah, so that's just a point about that, really.
Bear with me while I remember to unmute myself before I speak. Okay, back to the questions. So the couple that came up just in relation to some stuff you said, and I'm just trying to connect them together. I think there might be two different questioners, or maybe the same questioner. So it's addressed to Phil, and it's an anonymous questioner who asked, could Phil address Zion Lights' position advocating with Extinction Rebellion prior to her employment by Environmental Progress? Does she still hold that position? And the other question asks, does Zion Lights still work for Michael Schellenberger?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to answer that. And the simple answer is, I don't know those finer details. It was what I'd suggest people do is there is an article by Extinction Rebellion, which is the place to look into the specifics of that, where they address in detail Zion Lights' position that she held, and give their own perspective on that. It certainly the case that Environmental Progress UK was set up, and that is a group from Michael Schellenberger. So that was the case. But I think, so people can go and find out those finer details. That's not me to answer. But to emphasize the point about Zion is, it's kind of quite clear that this repentant critic narrative has been used routinely by nuclear proponents. I mean, Michael Schellenberger has almost based a career around it. Huge amounts of media coverage, and it appears time and time again. And what I'd say to people is, it's quite easy to find out if you look just a little bit, that it's doubtful whether in recent times they had a position that was anti-nuclear at all. So I think the important thing here to do is to call a spade, and really see a comms strategy for what it is, and to call it out on that. But what is astounding is how much media coverage it gets in Britain, because it's not really much of a story if you think about it. Somebody changes their mind on nuclear, yet it's covered in the Mail, in the Sun, in the BBC. Why is it that is such a newsworthy thing, when it is so difficult to get substantial issues about nuclear covered in the British press? That's the real issue that we need to talk about.
Unmute myself again. So, and then another question that we have. So we had some questions sent in ahead of the webinar as well, and for people who couldn't make it. And one of those says, I'm concerned that school pupils, such as sixth formers, are getting biased information about the nuclear industry to encourage them into the job sector. They have a very one-sided view and don't seem to know anything about risks or waste, but think nuclear power will be a safe, low-carbon source of electricity. Can any of the panelists address that concern? So I suppose they're asking about the bias in the information. And
Roland's got his hand up.
Oh, yep, sorry, beg your pardon, looking at the questions. Go for it, Roland.
Well, thanks. I mean, I speak as one of those. I mean, as a kid who trusted the BBC, the media, my school teachers, I'm sure they were honest people, but they were reproducing what they were fed, what information was fed to them. I remember being taken, a trip out up to Bristol University from my comprehensive school, where they gave us a talk about nuclear power. And they did actually say electricity so cheap, they won't bother to meter it. And in Britain, I mean, then struggling with post-war austerity, people struggling to heat their homes with very inefficient coal fires. I mean, that was the situation then. I know it probably feels like the Dark Ages compared with now. But, we believed what we were told. Your teachers are authority figures. The media, you assume speaks the truth until you can see through it and dismantle the way in which media bias works. I mentioned Chomsky and the propaganda model. Look it up, get wised up, look at examples of how it works. Unfortunately, we're being bombarded with it all the time, as well as sort of public relations exercises, advertising, and so on and so forth. These are big industries. There's 100 years of experience of public relations now, and they're very good at it. And you've got to do your research. I mean, as Pilger says, the truth is only 3 clicks away with a mouse. Do your research. And young people, I do trust their intelligence and their savviness, that they're much better at researching and being cynical and being a little bit distrusting. And I want to find out for myself. Go and do your research. Don't believe what you're being told. You can't always trust the obvious sources. So that's my answer to that. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I'd just like to interject a little bit there. I dropped some links into the chat box earlier about that, about doing your research, because, supporters of nuclear energy, that's Sir McAlpine and Bernard Ingham. Bernard Ingham was Margaret Thatcher's press secretary. He is the guy that went on the offensive with, loads of money from BNFL to rubbish wind farms over the last 20 years. And that's why we got a massive NIMBY movement. It wasn't because people didn't actually want wind farms. They were made to feel that way. That was done deliberately. And the evidence of this is everywhere. SourceWatch is really good. It links up lots of these, shows you the people who are involved with big front groups, and it shows you how to do research for yourself. Because I've got a degree, Phil's got a degree, Andy's got a degree, Roland's got a degree. We know how to do research, but obviously sometimes if you sat at home and it's really hard to work out what to do. So do have a look at those links that we put up so that you can work out how to do things for yourself. Andy, yes?
Yeah, just to build on those great points you made, Nikki and Roland made, about the importance of people power. I think this concern that the nuclear industry had, both military and civil, about what young people are choosing to do with their careers is a really crucial thing, because people power changes things in many ways. I mean, there's the obvious thing of mobilization and direct actions and just campaigning, like you guys, and I've been involved in that, and Phil's been involved in different ways ourselves. That's crucial. That changes the climate. It's also building new industries entirely. Cutting a long story short, we would not have commercial wind power in the world now had it not been for Denmark under the radar of the global nuclear industry, allowing it to develop. You can show that really clearly, how it failed in Sweden, failed in Britain, failed in Germany, failed in Japan, failed in USA, failed because the industry said it can't work. It worked in Denmark, a non-nuclear country with an anti-nuclear policy, where activists developed the early technologies from which the wind came. And then now, just the importance, the government is so concerned about skills for the nuclear base because people are voting with their feet. Engineers want to go into renewables, but BAE Systems and the government wants them to go into the nuclear industry. And in the end, I think that's a very important way of changing things, but not only by political action, by innovation, but also by voting with your feet in where you take your career.
Well said. And just to say that I thought I had some documents ready and I was all ready for dropping them into the chat box. I haven't realized that I can't actually drop the documents directly into the chat box. So sorry about being a little bit technology, not understanding there. What I actually need is web links for them. So, because I have some documents that are from the nuclear industry about just this, about their PR plans and about their recruitment plans. You know, I live in a community where 50% of the educational effort that's made about nuclear is made in my community, more so than in a community that doesn't host these facilities. Why is that? Because they want our people in these communities going into these industries. They want to be able to recruit there. So the propaganda in the schools is heavier. You know, the big issue that the nuclear industry deems that it faces is public acceptance. And that's really where all its effort is. And they're well ready to drop the climate change argument. And for, you know, they're always like one step ahead. You know, they've been talking about dropping the climate change argument since 2015. But, you know, here we are with them still doing all of that. And just to come back to some of the questions now, we've got some questions about small modular reactors coming in. Just bear with me a moment while I find the one that I just saw. Here we go. Robert Forsyth, if the cost of nuclear is so high and its impact on energy generation are negative because of diversion of money and time, and if its hidden purpose is to support military nuclear power, why is Bill Gates' TerraPower investing so much in alternative, greener nuclear power? Does anyone want to deal with that one?
I mean, I mean, the honest answer is I don't know what makes somebody like Bill Gates tick. I don't know him, so it'd be speculation on my part. But I think there is a wider culture, especially as a sort of macho, patriarchal, colonial culture that underlies a lot of techno geekery. I can't say anything about Bill Gates himself, but I can say there's a tendency for that kind of attitude to prevail among, you know, for instance, I mean, just the gendered part of it. I mean, there's others probably here know better than me. Men of my, I'm nearly 60. Men of my generation are much more prone to these kinds of thinking about, you have to control, you have to concentrate power. If you want energy, you have to have it in a really macho way. That kind of thinking, it goes with our culture, it goes with patriarchy. It's not just these direct military links and PR at work. But you also, I mean, it's a long established trend, and I can't speak for Gates again, whereby billionaires are very useful sources of supply of resources. If you manage to nobble a billionaire and get them to spend money, then you're doing a very effective thing if you're coming from a marginal industry. So the same kinds of dynamic we see in play in the ways Phil was documenting can be working among these super elite people as well. But whether that's the case or not with Bill Gates, I can't say.
Okay. Oops. Does anyone else want to add anything to that? Does anybody? Oh, right, let's just get back into this before I get ahead of myself. Bear with me a moment while I find the next question. Here's another one. So this is directly about the small modular reactors. What is harmful about the small nuclear reactors that they are researching? Nuclear energy can also be used for good in medicine, X-ray, and fusion. Right. Anybody like to speak to that? Roland?
Can I just answer the medical applications here? A friend challenged me on exactly this question, and the medical side, which I worked on, which would be therapy as well as imaging, can all be done without nuclear power. You can make the radioisotopes for imaging and for therapy without needing to put stuff into the power stations. There are other clean production facilities that can be used for that. So the two are separate. We don't need big nuclear power stations making things and byproducts and such like. You know, the two are separate. So somebody who's worked in nuclear medicine, which is imaging, and I'm aware of the therapy side as well, you know, I can answer that very clearly. You know, we're not dependent on the power industry to provide that technology. Thank you.
Well, Andy?
Well, Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just to, I guess, a point on the non-medical front about the risks of small modular reactors. I mean, many of the claims made that they, you know, reduce proliferation risk and these kind of things really don't stand up to scrutiny. I mean, the most credible small modular reactor designs are scaled down PWRs, and all of the issues that relate to large existing reactors relate to small modular reactors. And in fact, you know, it could be argued that if they're spread out more and these kind of things, then the security implications could in fact be more serious. And one thing about the risks is it has been said that if they are to be in any way economically viable, and they would still be a lot more expensive than renewables, they'll have to be located next to large population centers so you can use them for district heating and these kind of things. And you got to ask yourself, is that a risk that people are going to be willing to live with? So I think none of the substantive issues with nuclear are solved by small modular reactors.
And just in line with what just been said, another part of the question was on fusion, and it's often raised. So just to very quickly address that, fusion is really the same basic dilemma that we've discussed in relation to small and advanced modular reactors on steroids. It's been around as a prospect since the mid-50s. It was in 1957, it was projected to be 30 years in the future, and it has remained or exceeded 30 years in the future for the past half century, constantly moving ahead. I mean, this is not a partisan point. This is just the history of it.
Yeah.
There are now a new wave of claims. They always come around. It may be that it will come on form in some form, but claims made that it avoids proliferation are false. You can breed fissile materials in the blankets. It produces large amounts of intermediate level waste, different spectrum of waste than normal, but it still presents those sort of challenges. It's part of a nuclear industrial complex used by the military, and the safety concerns are there from that radioactive materials. And it also produces tritium, which is only now beginning to become realized as a potentially major public health concern as well. Following the Fukushima accident, it's been realized that tritium isn't quite what we thought, and that's a basic material used in fusion. So we can't say for sure what the issues are, but it certainly isn't relevant to climate change on the targets we have now. And there's evidence is that it presents all the same problems that nuclear power does. We have to ask why there's such a massively more is spent on fusion than renewable research put together. And that's a really peculiar situation.
Would anyone like to add to that? Roland?
If I can come back in on that, I mean, I'm probably the oldest person here, and all my life they've been talking about fusion is just around the corner. And they're still talking about fusion is just around the corner, just bung us loads of money, and this time it's going to work. Well, as we know, as was said earlier, you know, we've got till 2030 to substantially decarbonize our energy source. And fusion is pie in the sky off in the future. You know, if the conventional nuclear power stations can't be made to work, what hope is there for something that's experimental and very novel? You know, if it's going to work, we'll deal with that when we've done it, when we dealt with all the immediate problems. But they are very severe, and we need to deal with them by conventional things like you know, home insulation and you know, renewables. The technology is there, so we don't need to be distracted. Thank you.
Okay. So back to the questions that I've got here. That's right, 2 places to keep an eye on them. And
Nikki, sorry to butt in. While you're saying that, I mean, my memory as a kid is I was brainwashed by the space program and by big science and gee whiz stuff, as I call it. And fusion falls into that category. It blinds young people, and I have to say, particularly young boys. And it's a terrible distraction. You know, the answers are much more simple and close to home. And as was being said by the other speakers, you know, distributed local you know, solutions, not these big concentrated power sources, which of course have got the obvious commercial, you know, advantage that they want to make the stuff and then sell it to everybody else. And that's not the way to go. Thank you.
okay. So I have another question from another anonymous person who's maybe in the United States. It's a bit of a long one, but it says, in the US, FBI investigations have revealed widespread nuclear industry bribery and corruption, resulting in state legislature and nuclear leadership resignations and indictments in Illinois, Ohio, South Carolina, and Pennsylvania so far, as well as the booting of the leadership of Exelon, the largest nuclear utility, and halting some nuclear expansion that has been based in bogus data and payola under cover of clean energy. These cross-border legislative bills, lobbying and bribery agendas were cooked up through organizations like ALEC, but specific to the nuclear industry, well documented through the Centre for Media and Democracy, the partner organisation to the Source Watch project you've cited. These are transnational nuclear corporations and lobbying networks, allegedly using similar tactics in the UK, EU and elsewhere. How are investigations and prosecutions emerging and coordinated worldwide on this, given the evidence now emerging? Interpol, ? Parliamentary, ? Andy?
Yeah, I think it's a really, I mean, people should check out these, they're very well documented there in that question, what's happening in the US. It is a massive fraud, the equal to anything that's been seen. But it's not just in the US. France has got a massive fraud, two massive fraud cases associated in the nuclear industry, one with Orano and to do with uranium supplies, one to do with the falsification of safety certificates from the Le Creusot forge, where they make the pressurized water reactors that are, I mean, there's questions around the supply chain for the UK designs if they were built. And in Germany, that some of the biggest corporate fraud cases in Germany were Nuchem and to do with plutonium, going back many years now. So there is a propensity. I don't think we have to we have to demonize people. It's nothing to do with the people who are as well motivated, generally speaking, as anyone else, and Roland can speak to this, in the nuclear industry. It's not that there's bad people. It's the industry is secret and nasty things happening under the kinds of secrecy and deception that we've been trying to document. When an industry habituates itself to handling things that way, then it's a hotbed for corruption. All industries can be prone to corruption, renewables can be too, but they're far more open, there's far more defenses against that happening. So even the civil nuclear industry is so closed. When you add the military nuclear industry, it's a very unhealthy atmosphere for that kind of thing to happen.
Just to add very briefly that, of course, in the UK, there's been incidents to do with fraud as well. Of course, the falsification of documents around MOX sales with Japan in the early 2000s. But I think a broader point, and I'm very careful here this is not saying this is corruption, but I think a very interesting thing is to compare in the UK, for example, the way that deals are done bilaterally with government and EDF to agree a strike price behind closed doors, all these kind of things. It's a very different way of working than a sort of open and transparent process with regards to the costings and deals with renewables. So I think there is something to think about there in terms of the relationship between government and industry and how that differs with other technologies.
Okay. And so I'm going to take another question that we were sent in ahead of the webinar, and it says, I don't know who it's from. We were told that we need nuclear power because of intermittency gaps when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. Why then is National Grid turning off wind farms at vast cost and paying EDF Energy millions of pounds to try to lower output from its nuclear power stations? Go on, Andy.
Well, yeah, I'll have a quick rush. I mean, these things can get very technical to do with the grid codes and the kinds of contracts. But in a nutshell, in every single aspect of the way the British energy system runs, and especially the electricity system, nuclear is privileged. Research and development, contracts, finance, grid codes, operating regimes, you name funding systems, you name it. Nuclear has a privileged status. Regulatory systems, liability, it's got its own liability law to protect it, waste management, decommissioning, everywhere, every aspect of industrial activity, the nuclear industry is feather bedded. And one of those is the one this question is pointing to, that when nuclear is giving an output, put it in simple terms, if there's a surplus, it's the renewables who have to switch off and take a hit, not the nuclear, for no better reason than the system is designed to privilege nuclear. And that's that kind of entrenched privileging of this technology that Phil and I and so many others are asking questions about. Why are we treating this industry in this way?
Yeah. Phil, did you want to add anything to that?
No, not really. Other than, you know, this argument about intermittency, as we've stated in the presentation, you know, there's all kinds of solutions with storage, whether it's pumped hydro, thermal energy storage, compressed air, you know, and the cost reductions in storage technologies that are happening, that you know, that point of the question there that was mentioned is really, as we pointed out in the presentation, obsolete. There's ways of managing, and indeed the problem, as we're seeing in places like Scotland, is actually too much wind and so on, and you know, so there really isn't a problem there. You know, you get Scotland is a place where it's almost 100% of electricity consumption equivalent provided by wind energy alone for several months. So, you know, things are happening a lot more rapidly, and the system isn't keeping up.
So we had another question about small modular reactors that said, what's the difference between today's power plants and SRMs and ARMs? I'm assuming SRMs, they mean small modular reactors, and ARMs, they mean advanced modular reactors?
Yeah.
Go for it, Andy.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's what's, and it's a good question. And it's tricky to answer because actually SMR, small modular reactor, and AMR, advanced modular reactor, which is somewhat bigger, in fact, about the size of the early Magnox reactors at the upper end of the scale that we built in the 60s in the UK. So those two designs are really just about the modularity. The idea is you repeat the same design again and again, which in a way the French did anyway on large reactors through the 90s with their convoy system. But the idea is modular, so you don't incur these one-of-a-kind costs repeatedly. And then at the low end of the scale, you can construct these things at a factory like Rolls-Royce in Rainsway and Derby. We want to construct these things and then ship them on trucks to their sites. So after that, the particularities break down because there are so many different design traditions. I think I've counted more than 20 currently really pushed. I mean, there's much more than that in principle, but just being pushed around the world at the moment. A real exotic menagerie of different kinds of design traditions in both AMR and SMR concepts. So you can't really generalize about the design. Some of them are radically different. But the history we've learned from nuclear, and it's kind of interesting, there are, after similar profusions of designs in the 60s, everything came back to mama in a way, in that we ended up through the 70s and into the 80s with two basic designs: gas graphite reactors and light water reactors. Basically, cutting a long story short, the light water reactors descend from submarine propulsion. They have a high power density. They're very unforgiving. And the gas graphite reactors and the tubular designs allow you to take the fuel out when it's not used up yet. Why do you want to do that? Because you want to recover plutonium. So they're basically the two design traditions that caught on in civilian power production were both military designs, despite hundreds of different designs that were possible. And now we're seeing with SMRs and AMLs the same basic pattern, that we can predict that the designs that will actually be settled on, if these things are allowed to really entrench, will be military designs for battlefield power provision or naval propulsion or space propulsion. Those will be the ones that then spin off, and we're saddled with them in energy systems at massive cost. It's the same pattern that we saw in the first generation.
I'd like to just intervene there, if I may, just because my understanding of the history, you know, when I've sort of done my homework and researched the nuclear industry, is that we do this thing of economy of scale, and it was those smaller modular reactors that, you know, the military reactors, the submarine reactors, they were the first reactor designs. And my understanding was to get power, to get an economy of scale, they scaled up. Well, why did they scale up? To make it economic. So how is scaling back down to that size going to be more economic than the big one? I just want to say, unless you know, the laws of thermodynamics and things like that have changed, and some of those things that make economics, or at least in this capitalist system, if that hasn't changed, then I would say that my argument would be that the only reason SMRs got talked about at all, again, is post-Fukushima. Post-Fukushima, we had a wave of the industry dredging back up any old crap that they could in the way of bad ideas that they'd had before, to try and say, don't worry, the future will be any other reactor other than the ones they built at Fukushima. And there will be no private interest, I can guarantee you, running to you know, there's NuScale are trying to get involved in the English market. But, you know, the bottom line is, just like EDF can't find any partners to finance Hinkley or Sizewell, you know, the only people willing to finance this stuff are states. that want a military. China, UK, and they will be the only people that will fund SMRs. That will be the only way we'll actually see any SMRs built, will be because we have a policy that ignores, you know, the market actually on that. And just to come back to our list of questions, here's a good one. We were told that we'd need nuclear power because of, I think I did that, didn't I? About the, no, I did that, sorry. Craig Adland says, I have a question I would like to be asked if there is time. Have Andy or Phil reached out to or been asked by any media outlets for critical perspective on the role of nuclear in mitigation? If yes, has there been an open interest or resistance? I'm thinking many researchers tend to focus on how they might engage policymakers, but overlook how they might engage with publics. It seems that a new media landscape is emerging with Open Democracy, Novara and others, which have a stated aim of elevating critical perspectives, but which sometimes aren't achieving this as well when it comes to sustainability and mitigation contexts. Thank you. Andy, yep.
Yeah, have we reached out to the media? Yes. We have spent 4 years now, coming up for 4 years, intensively approaching the media. I mean, I used to work in NGOs. Phil's been doing this kind of thing for a long time. I'm not saying we're good at it, but we know how important that is, and we put a lot of energy into it to get this story out. And cutting a long story short, over that time, we spoke to the leading, and I think the count that when I last checked, 18 journalists in the UK, specialist journalists, of whom 2/3 picked the story up, the story that Phil especially, he and I summarized in our account today. 2/3 picked it up, called us back. We had long conversations, sometimes very long conversations with them. Of those, 3 ever took it forward. The vast majority were scotched at the editorial desk. For reasons I don't know, the reasons we were told was, this isn't a story, it's obvious, or it's a ridiculous conspiracy theory, which cancel each other out, actually. So it was only under peculiar circumstances with non-specialist journalists, initially Holly Watt, who was not an energy journalist, she's picked up from The Guardian. Then it was picked up by Roger Harrabin at the Today programme, and then we were going up to do an interview, shut down at the last minute from the editorial desk. Then he seemed to want to come back in again a bit later, and he did cover it, but he said he'd avoid the gatekeepers and put it out through the website. And then most recently, it was picked up, Ambrose, Evans, Pritchard, which we're very pleased about, in the Telegraph, which is not our usual source. So those journalists picked it up, and they're very idiosyncratic circumstances that led to that. By and large, and including, sadly, we put it to websites like Open Democracy, you get interest, it goes. Now, there are many, many legitimate reasons for this. We can't point to any, but what I can say is the climate in the UK, with the kind of stories that Phil ended on, the amount of coverage that piles in on the back of those trivial stories about somebody supposedly changing their mind when they manifestly didn't, because you can document it, compared to this, which involved billions of pounds of diversion of public money, just not getting through that media screen unless something accidental happens. That's, for me, it's much more worrying than nuclear power itself. I thought I was hard-nosed. I don't live in the country I thought I lived in. This experience of trying to put that, and there's some hairier stories than that we've got to tell as well, which are probably not appropriate to tell in a platform like this. But I don't recognise the country I live in from this experience for the last 3 years.
Just to add a little bit on top of that, in relation to Novara Media, and that is somewhere we could try. But I think picking up on what Andy was saying, talking about these media organisations new media organisations are very good and they do great stuff, but it is the broader climate of the UK, and in terms of the left, if you want to call it that, and I've engaged a lot with the Labour Party, and it is almost impossible, I find, to really get the nuclear issue discussed in any substantial way. It seems to be an assumed, sorry, my camera keeps going off. It seems to be an assumed feature of British culture that, or at least English and Welsh culture, that there will always be nuclear and we always need to build new nuclear, and it's just not questioned. And it's not questioned on the left. And remember what happened with Jeremy Corbyn and so on. He had to pretend to suddenly be in favour of nuclear, to placate the unions, to placate the base. In terms of Westminster, it is essentially impossible to be critical towards nuclear and stand a chance of getting in office. And that seems to percolate out towards all kinds of grassroots organizations who just don't discuss the issue. So it is this broader cultural thing that's going on that Andy's talking about.
And if it's all right, I wouldn't mind just chipping in on that because, yeah, you know, I don't recognise the country I live in either. I'm just a concerned mom. That's got me on the domestic extremist database for my activism. I don't recognise the country at all. I've done loads of media work as part of the campaigning that we've done. I think I did about 60 interviews saying that the project had been consented on 60 different occasions because, you know, they were always consenting it. Well, they only ever consented it once. So why did we need to hear that repeatedly repeated, you know? And yeah, the industry has its tentacles into everything. And that's a particular strategy. And I just want to come back to this issue of, it's not just the government and like that slide that I showed of, you know, it's academia, politics. It's also one of these people in the questions has called me a conspiracy theorist for what I said earlier about the grid being reserved for projects. Hinkley, the thing is, because of what I do, people approach me. I have workers approach me, nuclear industry workers approach me. And in fact, I got one of them to speak out. Peter Smith, he was an engineer at Hinkley A, and we had him speak at one of our protests because I encouraged him to. This industry gets into everywhere. Extinction Rebellion, I haven't been personally involved with Extinction Rebellion because my issue is this issue. But what did I have? And I'm also a member of the Green Party, and Phil, you addressed this Greens for Nuclear Power appearing. Well, the first thing they did before they did that is we in the Green Party, we actually make our policy at conference, unlike the Labour Party and the Tory Party. It's a very democratic and messy sometimes process, but our policy making process has always traditionally in the Green Party included Green Party members. So you can imagine my surprise when I saw an amendment pop up at one of our conferences, which was a pro-nuclear person who joined the Green Party just for that reason, trying to get through a minor amendment our policy direction on nuclear change. Now, it got struck down because you can't use a minor amendment to make a major change on policy. So what did they do? Because I've watched them the whole time. They went away and they made their little forums, you know, green, like oh, maybe nuclear's green. And they got, you know, some people like to join the party and to start having those conversations on digital forums. Now we actually have people running for leadership contenders in the Green Party who are pro-nuclear. How did that happen? That wouldn't have happened before the Green Surge, wouldn't have happened 10 years ago. And then Extinction Rebellion, I've had anti-nuclear campaigners from all over the country contact me. This is about a year ago, so I know you can see it for yourself. So basically, I had campaigners from all the Extinction Rebellion groups were supposed to be decentralized, so they were all under their own control, and just, you know, working in the communities that they operate in. Now, Roland, you've been very involved in Extinction Rebellion, so I'm sure in Bristol it maybe has a different flavour. But certainly what's been observed around the country is anti-nuclear campaigners go onto Facebook to raise the issue in a forum. Now, Extinction Rebellion is talking about climate change, and if nuclear is the way forward, then it should be really easy to have a conversation about what the technologies are. But actually, anyone trying to raise the nuclear industry, they were moderated out of existence. And so these people were contacting me, sending me screenshots and things of the conversations they were having. And I was funneling that to people in Extinction Rebellion saying, what's going on? Now, do I think that it's a coincidence that all of these disparate Extinction Rebellion groups just happen to have a pro-nuclear person doing their PR? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The nuclear industry made sure, you know, like they've got their Zion lights or whoever, they made sure that they've got their people in these places. These are parts of their strategies. You know, that's why that's why Westminster's so impenetrable. And they're trying to make the activist world impenetrable to us, and we can't allow that to happen. So I just feel really strongly that I needed to say that. Andy?
Yeah, may I come in, because I think it's or did you want to say something, Roland?
No, that's okay. You carry on.
On this point, because I think it is crucial. I mean, Phil and I made it. It's worth just mentioning again. Whatever side, when one is involved, you always are in any setting with people who say, "Well, it can't be that bad," you know. And what about all these environmentalists who are turning around? The crucial question is, for decades, we had really active major national organizations, for instance, on nuclear. We had, you know, a really much more critical commentary in the British media and in the big NGOs in London on nuclear for decades. Just at the point when the economics drops down. So now there is no argument on the economics of nuclear. It really is a basket case economically. And after Fukushima, when George Monbiot, just a few days afterwards, comes out, just when two of the biggest disasters occur to nuclear, so strangely, you get this rise in pro-nuclear commentary. Now, you can't point fingers at any individuals, organizations, or people, because it's a complicated world. Everyone has a right to change their view. And, you know, these issues are ambiguous and so on. So I'm not pointing fingers. I'm just saying, how can it be that when the fate of the nuclear industry has been the worst it's ever been, the advocacy is more intense than it's ever been? It really is strange. And if you think that's a conspiracy argument, Phil and I got called conspiratorial all the time with our argument in the early times. We're not being called it now that Macron has admitted it, that the US has admitted it. Strangely, they don't. But Michael Schellenberger, who we mentioned before, because Lion Lights works for him, Michael Schellenberger's organization wrote a blog when we first came out with our analysis of the military links, calling us mad conspiracy theorists. You can still see this. Then a short while later, it went quiet. We kept documenting it. The same organization, Michael Schellenberger, the same person who called us mad conspiracy theorists, wrote a big piece in Forbes magazine saying the links with the military are crucial because the military nuclear infrastructure is keeping world peace. And he had charts and diagrams showing as nuclear weapons go up, peace goes up, fewer people die in war. It's really actually, I think, quite obscene. But nonetheless, he made so you can see how the PR system works. It calls you a conspiracy theorist until that credibility evaporates, and then it flips in that case, and the media don't pick it up. Zion Lights works for that organization who did that, is on the public record, and yet she gets airtime whenever she wants. It's really quite chilling.
Yeah. So we're getting close towards the end of our webinar. So just on that subject, I think it will be on the closing slide, but on the Southwest Against Nuclear website, we've got a permanent link to an article that was produced by Ethical Consumer called Nuclear Chain Reactions, which outlined in 2006 what their PR strategy was going to go. I would advise anyone that wants to call me or Andy or Phil or Roland or anybody else who's concerned about nuclear issues, conspiracy theorists, to go back and read those documents. Read the documents that the industry produced themselves. You know, it's all there. It's hidden in plain sight. And so we're going to take this final question, and then we're going to close the webinar. And this last question says, if governments are saying they need nuclear power to meet their net zero commitments for climate change, how is carbon footprint calculated for nuclear power generation at the moment? And does this need to change? Go on, Andy.
I don't want to barge in, but I've worked on this, and actually this is a chance to make a barely dare do it, but a favorable point towards nuclear power. Because I've worked for 20 years on carbon accounting systems and risk assessment systems and input-output systems and all these methods for quantifying impacts and pros and cons of different energy technologies. And the bottom line through all these methods is you can get any answer you like out of them. Within the bounds of rigor provided by the disciplines, you can justify any ranking order you like across the technologies. There's a whole nother story to this, but for instance, take nuclear. Nuclear infrastructures where the steel and all the inputs and the fuel enrichment, the mining equipment is all powered by electricity, which is nuclear, would have a very different carbon footprint than nuclear starting in an economy we have now. So we should be very cautious about these precise numbers. And I'm making here a point, we shouldn't say there's a precise number to the carbon impact of renewables or nuclear. We should be talking about it in much more democratic ways about the issues that we think are important and be accountable for it, because these numbers conceal all kinds of assumptions. Both the numbers used by the nuclear industry, but also sometimes the numbers used against them are spuriously precise. So the answer to the question how they calculated is very opaquely, and typically the assumptions are far more volatile than they seem. But that doesn't mean that renewables aren't still the best way to reduce climate change. Because for reasons we gave in our talk, the costs and the speed are so much more effective than nuclear. It just means let's get bogged down in supposedly very precise technocratic arguments when we should feel much more empowered to talk about these things in common sense ways.
Thank you. Does anyone want to add to that?
Just very briefly, because I can see Sarah has say that I think
ready for us to stop. Yeah.
I just to back up what Andy says, to not get bogged down in these technical arguments. And another thing that strikes me about the case of the UK, as you pointed out, Nikki, for Hinkley C, there was an exceptional planning decision made to speed up the development, to make it happen, to say, and they gave a figure of, if it's built by 2017, it will save an extra million tons of CO2 and everything like that. And the entire rationale for the UK's nuclear renaissance set out in 2008, 2011, it's failed. It's failed. There hasn't been a significant amount of 16 gigawatts of new nuclear built significantly before 2025. New nuclear has not contributed 1 kilowatt hour towards reducing emissions. And why is it that this doesn't seem to matter? It doesn't matter if the nuclear industry repeatedly fails. Well, why it is because it's not really about climate change. It's not about energy. It is about Britain sustaining an industry and a suite of capabilities. And unless that is taken on, this will repeat. And so we need to get to that issue, and the military is driving it.
Thank you so much. Card, we could just do a whole nother webinar on so many of these things, and we've had some fantastic questions come in. I'm sorry that we haven't had time to answer every single question. I'm sure that CND would love to invite you all to do another webinar, and we can carry on this critical conversation, because there's so many places we can go with it. So I just want to thank you all very much for taking part this evening, and I'll see you all again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Roland. Thanks, Nikki.
Thank you.